Hello again. This is the week 7 lecture on information processing, approaches to understanding cognitive development in infants, children, and adolescents. Hope you are all well and getting through the weeks of this semester and are healthy and safe. So let's begin. In this, the learning goals will be to explain what the information processing approach is and contrast it with what we've talked about in terms of Piagetian and Vygotskian approaches to cognitive development. We'll focus particularly on attention and its developmental changes and memory and developmental changes from infancy through adolescence. Those are two major topics within this overall information processing perspective. We'll characterize thinking and its developmental changes. Thinking is kind of a very broad term, but things like problem solving and executive function. We'll define metacognition and also look at developmental changes. Okay, let's begin. So the information processing approach analyzes how individuals encode information, manipulate information, monitor what they know and what they don't know, and create strategies for handling this information, always with the goal of using that information at some point, to further their objectives, to learn about the world, to solve problems, and so forth. Like theories of Piaget and Vygotsky, the approach focuses on how we think. What you'll see is that it is not a stage-like approach that Piaget takes. It is really about the incremental increases in efficiency of thinking and how our capacity for handling information, the speed with which we handle that information. The way we handle the information doesn't change in these qualitative ways that were reflected in the stages that Piaget talked about. Different from Vygotsky too is that there isn't a large focus on sort of the social and environmental influences, although it certainly is discussed and explored in research that uses this information processing approach. You'll see this is just an example of a kind of information processing model of looking at memory in particular. And this model reflects kind of the inspiration for the information processing perspective. And that was the development of computers, particularly in the 1970s, when we really started to get an understanding of computers, and they were really sort of becoming a dominant form of information processing outside of the brain, right? And the way a computer handles information is that it has this hardware. And the hardware has limits on the amount of data the computer can process, its capacity and its speed. And you know this even with such a high-level technology today that you can buy, computers or tools or systems with a certain amount of memory. You can increase the memory, you can increase the speed of the processor, and so forth. And in the same way, our brains have a hardware kind of to it that has a certain capacity. And what we'll see is that as our brains develop, the capacity and the speed with which we handle information improves. And I would say, just as a side note, that we know enough about our brains and how they develop now versus what we knew in the 1970s, that probably the brain as a system is more of a metaphor or an actual, we look at it as the actual tools we use for thinking rather than using the computer kind of as a metaphor. But to continue with the computer metaphor that did inspire information processing theories, The software of the computers, the programs that we load into the computers, is really reflects the kind of data that can be used as input, the way the data is manipulated, the software programs for language recognition or for learning a new language like Duolingo and all of these new programs. That would be software specific for language learning, whereas you could also have software for mathematical reasoning, for helping a child with ADHD pay attention. In the same ways, our brains are specialized for handling certain kinds of information. The occipital lobe for our visual information, temporal lobe for auditory information, yet the brain is also very integrated and works together. So children's cognitive development from an information processing approach results from their ability to overcome processing limitations by executing basic operations like attention, like memory, like executive function. It also, development is reflected in expanding capacity, in acquiring new knowledge and strategies. As I said, though, information processing approach is a kind of continuity theory, a quantitative theory where everything is just getting better and better, faster and faster, more and more information with development from infancy, childhood, adolescence. If we're doing lifespan, it might plateau out in adulthood. Some things continue to rise, and there might be declines too at the end of older adulthood. So let's talk about cognitive resources, which is a very central theme in information processing approaches. Our resources have to do with capacity. How much can we process? How much information can we process at a given time? And speed of processing. How fast can we process it? As you might imagine, those two things work together. If you're faster processing information, you can probably process more of it. You can get things done, get that information out, bring in new information more quickly. So there are developmental changes in both capacity and speed of processing that are likely influenced by increases, developmental changes in cognition are likely influenced by increases in both capacity and speed of processing. And again, these are called cognitive resources because they have an important influence on memory and problem solving, on attention as well. And both biology and experience contribute to the growth in these cognitive resources. This was just a little image that I found online that just links actually brain development. So that would be biology, brain development from 0 to 1, 1 to 2, 2 plus, to increasing cognitive skills such as language development. So the biology also would be related to our genetics and our gene environment, those gene environment interactions. So some of us will have certain genetics for faster processing or for more facility towards learning languages or mathematical spatial reasoning. That may be coded in our genes, but it will also interact with the environment. We may have the genetic potential for certain types of cognitive skills, but if we don't have an environment supporting that potential, it may never manifest. Similarly, you could maybe not have as strong potential, but your environment can move you as high in that range of learning that is possible. So how quickly we process information influences what we can do with that information. And one method of assessment is using a reaction time task. The speed at which tasks are completed improves dramatically across the childhood years. So a simple reaction time task would be showing different letters going by on a screen, and every time the letter X shows up, you're supposed to push a button. Okay, it's simple reaction time. Just push the button to the X, and 3-year-olds won't be as fast. Well, let's not say 3 since we're doing letters, but let's say a 6-year-old won't be as fast at pushing the button to the X as a 10-year-old. And even a 16-year-old will be faster than the 10-year-old. The developmental change in processing speed has been shown to predict increases in working memory capacity and complex reasoning skills. So again, speed and capacity are related. The faster you can process, the more it kind of expands the capacity of what you can process. As you're processing information, you can kind of, again, put it aside, put what you've learned from that processing into long-term memory. It opens up more capacity for more information to come into working memory. Or reasoning tasks. If you're fast at processing, you can kind of keep track of where you are. You don't have to redo things. You can reason through a problem more efficiently. Let's watch this little movie on reaction time to give you a sense of what that's all about.
A family vacation in a Verbo means leaving all the craziness behind. Well, maybe not all of it. Crazy feels good.
Brain bites. Reaction time. I'm your PE pal, Flicker, but most people just call me a nuisance. Today's topic, reaction time. Reaction time is the time it takes to respond to a stimulus. What is a stimulus, you ask? A stimulus is an event the body recognizes through its senses that may need a response. You have 5 senses: sight, touch, hearing, taste, and smell. When a stimulus is sensed, a message goes to your brain. Your brain then sends a message to your body on how to react. The time from the stimulus to the action is called the reaction time. A quick reaction time can be important, like when you're driving. Reaction time is also very useful when you're playing sports, like net and wall games, and invasion games that require chasing and fleeing, like basketball, striking and fielding games that involve hitting a pitch or catching a ball, like baseball, races that start with a sound, like sprints, and combat sports, like fencing. Read this on your own. Pair share. Make a list of activities that benefit from a quick reaction time. Reaction time with sight. Have a friend hold a ruler above and between your thumb and pointer finger. When the friend lets go, try to catch it before it slides through your fingers. The number on the ruler where you catch it is your score. Reaction time with sound. Sit across from a friend. Place an object between you. Have a third person say go. See who can grab the object first. Reaction time with touch. Place your palms gently on top of your friend's palms. When your friend tries to tag your hands, see if you can pull them away. If you get tagged, switch positions. Your brain is reacting well to all the new knowledge from Brain Bites. Physical education's food for thought.
Okay, those were some cool ideas actually for reaction time, to test reaction time without any fancy equipment. Typically in reaction time research, you're doing it with very precise sort of measures to look at milliseconds of reaction time. But those are kind of cool exercises just to see your own reaction time compared to maybe a peer's. Certain mechanisms of change play an important role in advances in cognitive development. So here, the mechanism is really important. We can observe that cognitive development occurs. Children know more, they learn more quickly. But how does that happen? Mechanisms is about the how, and it's really the sort of holy grail of developmental psychology, is really understanding what are the underlying mechanisms that are producing this development that we can observe in behavior. So one of those is encoding, the process by which information gets into memory. We can't use that information unless it is in memory, which again is represented somewhere in the brain. And of course, we have to retrieve that information to use it. Automaticity is the ability to process information with little or no effort. We'll watch a little film on reading automaticity, but the idea is that anything that becomes automatic, it occurs because we've practiced it, we've repeated it over and over and over again. In the beginning, new skills take a lot of thinking, they take a lot of attention and intention. We have to be very intentional about what we're doing. But think about any new skill you've learned, tennis, skiing, or knitting, or a video game. It really took a lot of your attention. Think about what happened after you did those things over and over again and got what you thought to be as good at that and proficient. Many of those skills became automatic. That means they require less attention and less effort, mental effort. Strategy construction is another one of those mechanisms, the creation of new procedures for processing information. Reading strategies are also one of those things. We learn sort of how to read, very smoothly by, looking at sort of sections and using our background knowledge to make sense of what we're reading. Let's look a little bit at automaticity in reading and one of these mechanisms of change.
Hi everyone. Where in the world did summer go? I have no idea how it's already towards the end of August. But thank you for joining me today. I know many of you are already back in school. So today, let's tackle a question that's going to be really important for those of you teaching beginning readers. What is automaticity? Automaticity is the ability to do something without conscious effort because you've done it so many times. This is going to be really important for your beginning readers because automaticity is what's going to allow them to develop reading fluency and also reading comprehension. So before we talk about automaticity for reading, let me give you an example of automaticity that applies to you as adults. Think about driving your car. How did you get to work today, or how did you get home? If you drove, you might have had one of those days where all of a sudden you pull up to your office or your school and you're like, how did I get here? Oh, I really hope I stopped at that stop sign. You didn't have to think about all the details of driving because you've done it so many times. When it comes to reading, automaticity is quick, effortless word recognition. The students don't have to put conscious effort into decoding and reading the words, which means that they're able to put that effort into other things. After they have automaticity, they can put effort into reading for fluency. And once they have automaticity and fluency, they can put that effort into reading for comprehension. The biggest thing to keep in mind with automaticity, whether you're driving a car or whether you're learning to read, is that it takes repeated practice. Students need to encounter words over and over again to develop that automatic recall. Don't expect them to be able to read fluently or attend to comprehension when they're just beginning to learn to decode the words. We have to build that automaticity by giving them plenty of opportunities to practice. Then we can go ahead and work on fluency and comprehension. Thank you so much for joining me today. I hope to be back very soon now that summer is coming to a close. And so please go ahead and leave any of your questions.
Okay. And something to say about automaticity is that it will be developed for really routine behaviors and familiar behaviors and those that have been repeated, like driving a car or reading for us, for adults who are good readers. But as soon as something sort of changes and like a wrench is thrown into the system, imagine again with driving, if there's a sudden snowstorm or a hailstorm, or there's a detour that you weren't expected, all of a sudden your automaticity kind of is not a factor and you have to pay conscious attention again. That'll be true, especially as children develop, because they may become automatic readers for a certain level of reading, but you bump them up a level with new words and more difficult decoding of those words, and more difficult conceptual information, and it will no longer be automatic until they go through that process again of repeating and becoming automated, familiar with the information. Children's information is characterized by self-modification, and they apply what they learned previously in adapting their responses to new situations. So this self-modification is related to kind of self-monitoring, monitoring your own learning, using again what you know to help you learn new things. And metacognition is kind of one of those processes that helps with this self-modification, self-monitoring. Metacognition is knowing about knowing. It's knowing how you know some information, knowing how to learn information, knowing the best ways for you to memorize information or to pay attention. All of that is metacognition. It's thinking about your own cognition. And we're going to return to this towards the end, also when we talk about development of metacognition. Let's watch a little video that also describes metacognition in children. Why that's there.
Hi, my
I want to get rid of that.
name is Angela Kirby-Ware, and the next instructional design principle we're going to talk about is metacognition.
Metacognition is an instructional principle that shows students what it is that you're thinking.
Providing students with an example on how they should think about their thinking.
We see that a lot through the use of think alouds, think, pair, share, giving students some wait time, and then also showing them what it is that you're thinking. How do you solve a problem?
When teachers articulate how they are going about that process, students pick up on that language and they internalize that language.
Collection is another word that we need to know for this lesson. What in the world is a collection?
Put that answer in your brain. Mental math time.
There's some vocabulary that we need to know before we continue with the lesson. If the children are familiar with the vocabulary, there's more success. Do any of you have a collection at home? Can I help you? My son Thomas collects marbles. So he has a special place under his bed that he has this tin, and he has all different kinds of marbles in there. Does he have bottle caps in there?
No. If the teacher articulates how he or she is understanding that content, it allows the students to attach to those supports.
So this is what I would do to solve this problem. I would first look, like Quincy said, at the whole numbers. I know that 5 is the largest one, okay? So I'm going to write this number first.
Their own verbalizations, their own thought processes, how they understand the text.
Many of our students can actually do the work, but at times they need to verbalize the work. This step's correct, what would be next? And they verbalize that to us.
Okay, I think you have the idea there. Go back. This was metacognition as applied to teaching, which is really important, but you got the gist of that in that it's about thinking, knowing how we think. And this was teachers modeling that, because adults have metacognition too. We use it all the time, and we're more aware of it, so we can kind of model it and show children that the process of thinking about their own thinking. So just laying out this information processing theory, the idea is that it's about, capacity, speed of processing. Those are two really core ideas that kind of underlie all of information processing. And it's part of what is developing. Well, what are the mechanisms that help both speed of processing and capacity? The encoding, the strategy development, something else in there, an automaticity, right? So, metacognition is very much tied to the strategy construction, understanding our strategies. So like Piaget, information processing sees children as directing their own cognitive development, that it's really coming from within. It identifies cognitive capabilities and limitations at various points in development. So it is similar to Piaget's theory in those ways. But unlike Piaget, the approach does not see development as occurring in these distinct stages, these stair-step kind of stages in which there is like qualitative change in the way we learn about the world, think about the world. Instead, it is this more straight line, linear, continuous sort of development. Children gradually develop the ability to process information. They get faster. They can handle more information in terms of capacity. They develop more sophisticated strategies. The information processing approach also focuses on a more precise analysis of change and the contributions made by ongoing cognitive activity. So information processing approaches are very focused on those mechanisms of change. How are kids getting faster? What are those mechanisms, the how of this all happening? So here we're going to talk about attention, what is attention and how it develops from infancy through adolescence. And then in the next section, we'll talk about memory in that same way. So attention is the focusing of mental resources. If you think about that information processing approach, kind of like with like boxes, like a flow chart, attention's right at the beginning of that. You can't encode information unless you pay attention to it. In fact, there's tons of information going on right now. My dishwasher is going right now. I can hear it. Now that I've talked about it, I'm paying attention to it. But what I really need to do is not attend to that while I'm doing this lecture. So there's a lot of information surrounding us that isn't relevant to our current goals that we don't pay attention to. But attention's necessary to to just bring that information into the system, the information processing system, which is our brain, in order to use it going forward. So children allocate their attention in different ways, and so do adults, in fact. Selective attention is focusing on one aspect of experience that's relevant while ignoring others that are irrelevant. So my example of the dishwasher going, I need to selectively attend to this PowerPoint slide, to talking about it, and ignore the distracting information. As you might imagine, that's something that really develops, that children, young children, are quite distractible. They're not even very clear, what aspects of their environment are relevant versus irrelevant. That takes learning. Divided attention is being able to focus on more than one activity. So that whole idea of being able to do more than one thing at a time requires this divided attention. That takes a lot of cognitive resources, as you might imagine. Sustained attention is really, really important in school, as is selective attention. But for children in school, being able to maintain attention to a selected stimulus for a prolonged period of time. So, there are reasons that formal education starts at about 5 and isn't starting at 2.5. 2.5-year-olds may be in preschool and daycare, but for 2.5-year-olds, 3-year-olds, there aren't these sustained lessons where everyone has to sit in a circle for a long period of time. It's very short snippets. By kindergarten, they're expecting children to be able to maintain their attention, sustain their attention for periods of time. Executive attention is the attention we focus on for planning actions, giving attention to goals, detecting our errors and adjusting for those errors, monitoring our progress, dealing with new or difficult circumstances. It's attention for usually goal-directed activities. So I'm going to move this a little. In terms of attention in infancy, this is very interesting to be able to measure cognition and information processing in infants. It really takes quite a creative approach, because as you can imagine, we'll talk more about what infants actually know, which is a lot more than even Piaget suspected. But because infants are pre-verbal and they can't understand a lot of language, especially early, they can't produce much language, you actually rely on their abilities to orient their attention and kind of investigate, look, gaze at something, scrutinize something, pay attention to it, to tell us what they know and what they don't know. So an orienting investigation process dominates attention in the first year of life. Everything is new. This involves directing attention to potentially important locations in the environment, recognizing objects and features, recognizing faces of important people that feed you, that cuddle you, that come to you when you cry. And again, like I said, everything is new. And one thing we have learned over the decades is that infants, even very young infants, are very attracted to novelty, to new things. First of all, everything is new right away, but after they've seen it over and over, it becomes familiar. So the habituation-dishabituation paradigm or testing procedure has really revolutionized the way we tested what infants know, and in fact, what they even can remember. Think about this, that in the habituation paradigm, the researcher presents the same stimulus over and over again to an infant. It's called the habituation phase. So you might see this woman's face with her hands like this, okay? This woman's face with their hands like this over and over again. What they see, and I'll show you a video of this, what they see is that infants at first look for a long time at that woman's face like this. And then the next time it's shown, they'll stare a little shorter time, shorter time, shorter time, shorter time. It's called decreased, habituation is decreased responsiveness to a stimulus after repeated presentations. Now, the only reason you would become bored or habituated to something is because it's familiar to you and you like looking at new things. And we know that about infants. But something can only be familiar if you recognize it, right? So even by virtue of the fact of this decreased responsiveness actually says that an infant has some rudimentary recognition memory. They are saying in their own little baby brain, this is the same woman, same woman, same woman. Same means they recognize that picture after it goes off and it comes back, goes off and it comes back. Well, it's possible they just were getting fatigued and just bored with looking in general. So what they do is they show a new picture. Now they might show it by itself. That's often the case. Or they might show it paired with the old picture. Let's imagine they just show the picture by itself. Now it's the same woman, but her hands are not like this, but like this. Okay, pretty small change, right? But if the baby is just fatigued, it doesn't matter if you show them something new, they're still not going to look longer, right? But if they look longer at this picture, it's also saying basically that they recognize the difference between the old familiar picture and this new picture. They have recognition memory of the old picture and they can distinguish it between the new picture and the old picture. It tells you something also about what they know, that they sort of see the difference between this and this. And that'll become important in when we talk about concepts that they're learning. So they can also pair it with the old picture and see if they look longer at this picture versus that. They look about the same at these two, then there's no preference. And we know they prefer novelty, but that would suggest that they don't see this novelty. So let's show you a little video. I'll probably go in between them. Let's see. Oh, not showing up yet. Try that again. Mm-hmm.
If I showed you something that you had never seen before, you would probably look at it for a few seconds. If I then showed you that same thing again and again, however, you would tend to get a little bored and look at it less. Many people are surprised to learn that even newborn infants exhibit this tendency to habituate to a repeated stimulus presentation. Let's watch a 2-month-old's very first experience of looking at a jar of cayenne pepper. The colors are bright, the bottle is shiny. It clearly holds her gaze for a while. After about 32 seconds, however, she looks away. We can plot that on a graph so you can see how it changes as we repeatedly present this jar. After she looked away, I placed the bottle out of her view for about 15 seconds and then showed it to her again. Here comes the second time that this little girl ever saw a jar of cayenne pepper. She looked at it again, of course, but this time looked away after about 14 seconds. I hid the bottle for 15 seconds and then showed it to her again. Now she only looked for about 6 seconds. You can see the trend emerging here. The fourth and fifth presentations only elicited about 3 seconds and 2 seconds of looking each. You can clearly see that this child is getting habituated. She looks at the stimulus for a few seconds and then looks away. Think for a moment about what the infant must be able to do in order to exhibit this habituation behavior. First, she has to be able to see. Based on this brief presentation, I can be sure that this girl can see what's going on around her. Second, she has to be able to control where her eyes are aimed. This seems to be an ability that infants possess from the moment they are born. Third, and most impressive, I think, the infant must be able to recognize the repeated object. She must have a functioning memory. Most people don't have any explicit memories of the things that happen before they are about 4 years of age. Presumably this baby won't remember this experience either when she's a grown-up. But habituation shows us that this baby's memory is already functioning. So we've gotten this baby bored with cayenne pepper. What if we show her a new object? Let's watch her first ever experience of seeing a jar of celery salt. She looked for about 6 seconds. When I switched back to the cayenne pepper, the looking time was about 4 seconds. Hey Pumpkin, you ready? During the next 2 presentations, the celery salt and cayenne pepper received looks of about 6 seconds and 3 seconds. The baby is looking longer at the new object. It seems that she can tell the difference. Can she read the bottles? Probably not. There are a lot of differences between the 2 objects. For instance, the shapes of the lids are different, and the colors of the spices themselves are different. If a baby detects any of these differences, it will inspire longer looking duration.
Okay. All right, that's a pretty good example, not quite the way it would be done necessarily in a research study, but you could see that, again, what he suggested was even something like cayenne pepper in a jar, the baby was recognizing it after the 15-second delay, recognizing it, and again, it was a familiar stimulus. So Yes, this is looking at attention because that is the way we measure it with looking time. But it really does also have implications, habituation, dishabituation for recognition, memory, and for developing a concept, a rudimentary of this red stuff in a bottle versus some green stuff in a different bottle. And those two weren't that different, but yet there was some discrimination between those. Another kind of attention, so I should put myself back up here. Another kind of attention is called joint attention. Very, very important between caregivers and infants. It's where two or more individuals focus on the same object or event. It's frequently observed by the end of the first year. Infants begin to direct adults' attention to objects, pointing, and again, just might be using a word possibly, or just a sound, but they really want to look at things and actually even start to learn their names, something we'll talk about next week. This increases infants' ability to learn from other people. Joint attention is also associated with the development of self-regulation. Um, they're bringing someone else into their attention, what they're attending to. The other person can help regulate the child to kind of continue and sustain their attention to that object or that event. Joint attention requires the ability to track another's behavior, such as following their gaze. Infants will look at something that their caregiver is looking at. One person directing another's attention and kind of reciprocal interaction. All that's really important, not only to learning concepts about the world, but also learning about each other and about social interaction. So here's an example of joint attention. Rochelle Brooks and colleague Andrew Meltzoff in 2005 found that infants began to engage in a behavior called gaze following at 10 to 11 months of age. So they'll reference the face of the caregiver, whoever they're with, see where that caregiver is looking, and they will follow that gaze. They're already even developing a sense of others' intention. Somebody's looking at something, they must be intending to look there. That must mean there's something important over there and I should look at it too. The child's ability to pay attention improves significantly during the preschool years. Especially children make advances in executive attention and sustained attention. So here they're starting to be in preschool or some kind of childcare situation with other kids. There's a lot of distractions, but they're starting to be able to slowly sustain their attention to achieve some goals, and that in play or in some other learning situation. Control over attention continues to show important changes during middle and late childhood. What is salient or obvious will grab the preschooler's attention. They'll start to kind of, that helps them figure out what's relevant. If the relevant information is brightly colored, is moving, is making sounds, that's certainly going to help them realize that that's important, that's relevant. That's actually the premise behind Sesame Street when that began in the 60s, and it's still going strong. And a lot of other children's programming, they'll make the obvious information like learning numbers, learning letters, be brightly colored, animated, making music and so forth to help orient their attention to that. After the age of 6 or 7, children start to pay more attention to features relevant to a task or problem. By 6 or 7, you don't necessarily have to grab their attention with the salient or obvious features like color and movement and so forth. The ability to control and sustain attention is related to school readiness and academic success. So, these early attention skills are really important. Again, they're usually not going to be in one-on-one instruction, so they have to selectively attend, screen out attention, distractions, divide their attention sometimes between teacher and their paper in front of them, as well as sustain their attention. Sustained and executive attention are important aspects of adolescent cognitive development. An increase in executive attention supports the increase in effortful control required to effectively engage in complex academic tasks. Obviously, once they move through elementary school, middle school, high school, more and more this is relying on independent learning. The teenager is not going to have somebody monitoring their learning like it was 10 years prior to that. And so they need to do what's called effortful control, which is control their own learning, keep monitoring it, keep thinking whether they're on task or off task. This is really kind of an issue actually with the online learning that's going on now. I just watched some news reports on this with teenagers in high school who may have complained a year or two ago about going to high school, but many of them are saying, I wish I was in school. I need that structure for motivation, for persistence. It's sort of really taxing their own effortful control to do it all on their own or in front of a screen. One trend involving divided attention is multitasking. Heard about that a lot. A major influence is the availability of multiple electronic media. Multitasking expands the information adolescents attend to and forces the brain to share processing resources. And this other intrusive distractions can come from competing thoughts in the individual's mind. So multitasking could be from different media sources and electronic sources, or it can be sometimes the thoughts of your own head that create this multitasking environment. In general, I believe the research shows that we're not really doing more than one task simultaneously, but we're shifting between tasks very quickly. Sometimes we can do it quickly and efficiently without too much loss on either task, but it feels like we're doing it at the same time. But basically, it's this very quick shifting of resources. Okay, moving out of attention to memory, we'll also talk about what memory is and how it develops from infancy through adolescence. Memory is the retention of information over time. It requires, or it involves, three major components, major processes. Encoding is that getting information into memory. Can't do anything with it unless the information comes in, and we lose lots of information that is never actually encoded. We have to store that information over time, retain it for some further use. And then if it's stored, that's great, but it's not great if you can't find it, right? It's like, putting something away in your place where you live and it's stored and tucked away, but it's not going to be any good for you if you cannot retrieve it or find it. So retrieval is that last step, taking information out of storage. And failures can occur in any of these processes. And it's been a real challenge for memory research, although they come up with clever ways to do this, is when someone can't remember a stimulus that has been presented to them, it can be difficult to know based on their performance, the failure to remember, was it a failure at encoding? Did it never get in? Was it not stored ever? Or is it a failure at retrieval? There are ways of kind of disentangling this to some degree. So different types of memory. There's short-term memory, where that's how we retain information for about up to about 30 seconds without rehearsal of the information. And you can retain it for longer if you repeat it. So An example of this would be, I've been getting so many of those little authentication codes or verification codes on my phone when I'm doing something. And I think they're about 6 digits. I used to forget those all the time and have to look back at it, like it would immediately leave my brain before I got used to, again, automaticity. I got used to them coming in. And supposedly I should be able to remember it without repeating it, but I probably do rehearse it a little bit to make sure I remember it between my phone and my laptop. Long-term memory is relatively permanent and long lasting. It should be stored there somewhere and represented in the brain. But again, if we can't retrieve it, it may be stored there and we're not retrieving it, or it may not have ever made it into long-term memory. Working memory is very interesting. Aspect of memory. It used to be kind of categorized with short-term memory, but it has, over the last couple decades, it's been really of interest to researchers. Working memory is the information that we're holding kind of online, you might say, in our memory, in our active memory. We're thinking about it, and we're holding it there in order to manipulate it, put it together, maybe combine it with information in long-term memory. We're working on it. We're using it for usually some kind of immediate goal. Working memory is used for making decisions, for solving problems, comprehending language as it comes in. As I'm doing this, the information on the slide is in my working memory, but I'm also trying to combine it with other information that I just know in my knowledge base. And so working memory does a lot of work. It's really important for just learning in school and even in social interactions at your job. There's almost no place where working memory isn't involved to some degree. It's linked to many aspects of children's development. So example of working memory, I won't go through this. This is the Badley model of working memory. Basically, Badley, who's kind of one of the fathers of working memory, said that there was both a phonological loop. This is where auditory information, particularly language, would be processed, and a visual spatial working memory for not language based, but visual based and information based. And both of those go into the central executive, where it is worked on and used for making immediate responses, but it draws from long-term memory. It can also put information into long-term memory through this process. An example of a working memory task that's now part of the Wechsler intelligence test is called letter number sequencing. And you would not be seeing this sequence, but hearing it. If I said, I would say these letters and numbers to you, but actually the task for working memory is to not just repeat them back, which would be more of a short-term memory kind of situation. But for working memory, we want them to work on the information, manipulate it. So the task for letter number sequencing is to hear the string and then reorder the string into numbers that go from lower to higher and letters that are in alphabetical order. So E, 1, R, 8, M, Z, 7. You would be hearing them come in. You'd be having to reorder those to 1, 7, 8, E, M, R. Okay, that's an example of a working memory task. You don't just repeat it back as you heard it. You actually have to do something to it, manipulate it, in this case, reorder it, and then repeat it back. It's a much more difficult task. In constructing memories, we all use schemas. Schema theory is where people mold memories to fit information that already exists in their minds. So schemas, similar to how Piaget talked about schemas as kind of a framework, whether it's sensory motor schemas or more conceptual schemas. Schemas can be seen as mental frameworks that organize concepts and information, and schemas influence the way people encode or make inferences about information or retrieve information. So, for example, if a child goes to the zoo a lot, they'll have a mental schema for what happens at the zoo. What do I do when I go to the zoo? Where do I go in? What animals do I see first? Where do I go next? What are my favorite animals? Do I go on the little train? Do I get a snack when I'm at the zoo? All of those things are part of their zoo schema. So if a 6-year-old went to the zoo yesterday and I asked that 6-year-old, what'd you do at the zoo? They'll remember some details, but they also might fill in some gaps of what they don't remember with just their usual zoo schema stuff. Like, did I go on the train? Maybe, but I usually go on the train. It's part of the zoo schema. So I'll just talk about that too. So unlike the way computers operate, we reconstruct the past, and our minds can distort an event as they encode and store impressions of it. So these schemas are really helpful for us to organize our memories and then retrieve them because we kind of fit a structure. But it can also mean remembering details that didn't actually happen. So that relates to what's called fuzzy trace theory. And this states that memory is best understood with two types of representations. A verbatim memory trace. When we say verbatim, it's like as it actually happened. Verbatim memory trace would be precise details of the information. So it'd be like if we took a video of a 6-year-old child at the zoo, that would be a verbatim trace. We would know what animals they saw first, second, third, and whether they went on the train and whether they had a snack. It would be like a video of the experience. Is that what we're storing? That would be difficult to store every single detail of our lives. And that would be maybe similar to like a photographic memory, which is not very common. Now, the gist is something you probably can relate to. The gist is more the central idea of the information. I went to the zoo. I saw animals. I did a couple other zoo-like things, okay? So what do we know about fuzzy trace theory and development? What we know is young children actually tend to store and retrieve verbatim traces. They won't be able to store all of them. So when you ask a 6-year-old about their visit to the zoo, it might feel kind of disjointed. Oh, I saw the hippo. And then I saw my friend, Carolyn there, and she was by the elephants. And then, we also went on the train and it was really bumpy. So there'll be like individual pieces of actual verbatim, but they won't have sort of the whole story of the zoo visit. During elementary school years, they begin to use gist more. It suggests they're kind of using more of their schema that, of course, they've developed over years of going to the zoo. A young child maybe has only been to the zoo a couple times, so maybe they haven't developed that schema yet. But by the elementary school years, they have all kinds of schemas: zoo, going out to eat, going to school, and going to the park. And they begin to store their memories kind of in these schemas and be able to just talk about the gist, what you generally do at these places. This contributes more to improve memory and reasoning because fuzzy traces are more enduring, less likely to be forgotten than verbatim traces. So the fact that child saw their friend Carolyn at the zoo is a verbatim actual event, but not so important to remember as much as remembering all the animals you saw and learning about animals and developing concepts of animals. So our ability to remember new information about something depends on what we already know about it. So again, the more a child goes to the zoo, the more knowledge they have of the different animals at the zoo, the more they can talk about those kinds of things, as opposed to these little events, little random events that are not that important necessarily to remember. Experts have acquired extensive knowledge about a particular content area. And this knowledge influences what they notice, what they pay attention to, how they organize that information, represent it, and interpret that information. And all of this affects their ability to remember the information, to reason about it, to solve problems. So a really famous study by Mickey Chi in 1978, late 70s, was looking at memory of 10 and 11-year-old children versus college students. Now, you would think, based on our just theory of information processing, speed of processing, capacity, and strategies, that children's memory is not going to be as good as college students, okay? So if you just think of this as 10 and 11-year-old children versus college students remembering random numbers, that makes sense. Well, the children she picked, though, actually were 10 and 11-year-old children with experience playing chess. They had some expertise in chess. And she compared them to college students who had no expertise in chess, no experience. For remembering random numbers, that chess experience didn't matter. And what we saw was just maturationally, college students are better at remembering random numbers than children with chess experience. But asking them to remember the spatial arrangement of chess pieces, it totally flipped the script here. The 10 and 11-year-olds were better than the college students. 10, 11-year-olds with chess experience better than college students without chess experience. They were able to use their expertise, the children playing chess. There was a schema, there's a way of organizing the spatial arrangement. It had meaning to them. The more something has meaning, the more likely it's going to be encoded, more, kind of established in a way that makes sense and can be retrieved in a way that can make sense. So here, their expertise with chess help them with their memory for spatial arrangements of chess pieces. And all of a sudden, young children can be better than older, young adults here in their memory based on their expertise. Memory in infancy, let's look at it across development now. Infants as young as 3 months of age show early stages of memory development. You saw in that film that even a 2-month-old, and I think it's probably pushing it even a little, that 2 months could be seen too. In habituation, they were showing some rudimentary memory. Infants can remember perceptual motor information really easily. This kind of fits with Piaget sensory motor stages. That is, even when they're doing circular reactions and they might hit a mobile and it moves, that's a rudimentary memory of, if I hit that mobile, it's going to move. I like that. And the fact that they repeat it suggests they're developing kind of a schema or memory of that action and reaction kind of situation. Implicit memories are memories without conscious recollection. And a lot of what infants are doing, like even the memory for the cayenne pepper and distinguishing it from the celery salt, was implicit in that there's no language associated with it. Our memories for how to tie our shoes and button our coats and things like that are implicit now. We could make them explicit and explain it to someone if we needed to. Explicit memories are conscious memories of facts and experience, and infants don't seem to show explicit memory until about 6 months of age. It's interesting. It's before they're actually producing language, but they may be starting to understand language, or at least some labels or some concepts that are different. And so they're becoming more explicit, those memories. Here was a technique used in Roe v. Collier's investigation of infant memory. So it's a memory that is in a sensory motor action. They tied a little ribbon to the baby's foot, and when the baby shook that foot, it made the mobile move, similar to that swiping of the mobile. And it was very interesting to see when you put that baby back into the crib, whether they would remember that sensory motor action and would repeat that action again, because they enjoy watching the mobile move. And how long could they retain that memory? And did that length of the memory retention, did it increase with age? Here's a video of the Roe v. Collier experiment.
Some recent experiments with 3-month-olds have revealed a surprisingly complex mind already at work.
I think that most people who work with human adults think that babies are like rats until they're 8 or 9 months of age. And I think that what we've shown is that babies are very human from the moment they're born. You say, hi, I'm Peggy, I talked to you on the phone.
Infancy researcher Carolyn Roe v. Collier and assistant Peggy Borza make a house call.
How are you? I talked to you on the phone. Yes. I'm Carolyn Roe v. Collier.
John B. Watson's work helped shape the attitudes of an earlier generation. This new research helps document a new vision of the infant.
We're going to be teaching you a game, Martin. Yes, he says. Well, it's one of these things, you know, you can lead a baby to a mobile, but you can't make him want to play if he doesn't want to. Give me something to do down here. What do you say?
Martin's foot is attached by a ribbon to a separate stand, not to the mobile itself. Peggy counts his kicks. This gives a comparison for the experiment which follows.
How you doing, good guy, huh? Kind of boring down there. Nothing going on.
Peggy connects the ribbon to the mobile.
I get some action.
Now Martin can see and hear the consequences of his actions. His rate of kicking doubles. The infant is now an active player in his world. But that's only one part of what these experiments reveal. Next, it was on to visit Michael, one of a pair of twins whose parents stayed around for Roe v. Collier's explanations.
How would you want her to be put in it? Head down the other way, head up that way.
Michael explores the ribbon, although it is not yet attached to the blocks. But still, he gives it what Carolyn Roe v. Collier calls the good old college try.
He's so active that it's going to be difficult to show that he's learned. Although, who knows? He likes to make the ribbon go, though. He's picked up on that.
3-month-olds cannot crawl or walk, and research has shown some parents, especially fathers, think infants only become people when they begin to speak. But sometimes, actions speak louder than words.
Seems to be getting to the point that he's only moving the foot that makes the mobile work. So he's just waving that foot like a flag. This child is controlling this visual spectacle to make happen what he wants to, what he enjoys.
From birth, there were the reflexes and perceptual preferences. Now the child is learning to construct and repeat activities which please him.
Okay. So what that research showed was that that very young babies can make what's called contingency learning, the association between their moving their foot and the the movement and sound and movement of the mobile. That was really important. They can make that learning association, which was probably surprising. And the fact that they once after a delay, and that's the question, how long a delay, but after a certain delay, if they're put back in that crib with that same mobile, and then they see that ribbon, are they remembering that if I move my leg, the same thing will happen. They like to move their legs anyway, and that's why they compared the leg movement without the attachment to with the attachment. They also saw that the leg that was attached was moving more than the other one. So it suggests they had this rudimentary memory, implicit as it was, of if I move my foot when I see that ribbon in that mobile, this thing is going to happen again. And what they saw, well, I think it's later on actually, was that with older and older infants, they could remember this whole contingency, this association for longer periods of time. They could maintain that memory for longer periods of time. We'll see that in a moment. So most adults can remember little, if anything, from the first 3 years of their life. It's a phenomenon called infantile or childhood amnesia. It is thought because there's an immature hippocampus here, which is also connected to the prefrontal cortex. That the brain area is important to encoding memories and organizing memories is immature. The amygdala is on this picture too, because it turns out it's pretty important because fearful or intense, emotionally intense experiences are often encoded, even more strongly. And a lot of times our earliest memories are those that had some kind of strong emotional content. Most young infants' conscious memories appear to be fragile and short-lived, but by the end of the second year, long-term memory is more substantial and reliable. So going back to the Roe v. Collier research, he would have found with this that for 6-month-olds, they could remember, if she came back 24 hours, they could remember that they should shake their foot to get the mobile to move. With those 2.5-month-olds, it could be much more fragile, maybe 20 minutes, maybe an hour, I'm not sure. But by 6 months, they could remember for a full day. By 9 months, she could come back in a month and they'd remember. 10 to 11 months, just a couple months later, and it's tripled to 3 months. You can see this by 20 months, they could remember for a full year. And they were talking about two-year-olds really having more established long-term memories. Now, memory in childhood, children's memory improves considerably after infancy, of course. They're going to start going to school, and where memory is going to be really important. They can remember a great deal if they're given appropriate cues and prompts. That kind of harkens back to Vygotsky's scaffolding and where you can help to scaffold memories. Their growing knowledge is one likely source of their memory improvement. Again, they're developing schemas, getting the gist, they can fill in the gaps if needed. Other sources of improvement include increased use of gist, changes in memory span, the use of strategies. So memory span increases with age. Speed of information processing and rehearsal of information are important aspects. Again, the faster you can do it, the faster you can move information from short-term or working memory into long-term memory and kind of move that information through, which kind of increases the capacity of what you can learn and remember. So here's a classic study. Memory span increased by about 3 digits from 2 years of age. Here's 2 years. Their memory span was about 2 units, but by age 5, let's see, from 2 years to 7 years, sorry. By age 7, it was 5 units here. So it improved 3 units between ages 2 and 7. And by age 12, it was equal to adult level, which we tend to think of short-term memory span as 7 plus or minus 2. And of course, that can be improved through various strategies, the capacity of memory span. And that brings us to this slide. Certain strategies can benefit children's long-term retention of information. So if children organize information when they encode it, their memory benefits. So we know that we use chunking a lot. We organize information by categories. So if you're trying to remember what to get at the grocery store and you haven't written it down, you will probably try to organize the list in terms of fruits and vegetables, in terms of meat, if you're buying that, in terms of canned goods, even where it is in the store. That would be a way to remember, 15 items and keep it in working memory, which is double what would be normal by just chunking it. Maybe you could remember even more than 15 items. Memory also benefits from elaboration, which involves engaging in more extensive processing of information. So even beyond just chunking it into categories, if you elaborate on it like, oh, I'm buying these things to make a particular meal, or I'm going to also remember it based on, again, location in the store. I'm going to make an image of myself walking through the store. That's the last bullet point of where it is. And I'm going to imagine myself walking through and getting this information. All of this helps with memory, unless we just want to write it down, which is not a bad idea either. In terms of teaching strategies, you also want to enhance memory. In teaching, another good strategy is to encourage children to understand the material that needs to be remembered. This is going to facilitate organizational and elaboration strategies. If you have some understanding of it, just like the material here, you've had Psych 230 or some other developmental classes, which already gives you some background knowledge, or cognition, or another class, it helps you to organize and kind of elaborate on it, come up with examples. That really helps with memory for information. Other strategies in teaching is to repeat the information, varying it by different kinds of instructional methods and linking up the information across those methods. Maybe teaching a science concept in lots of different ways to kind of converge on that concept. Embed memory relevant language when instructing children. You saw that a little with the metacognition. Here's how I remember things. Let's think about it and let's remember it. Let's try to recall it later. That would be memory language. How about children as eyewitnesses? In terms of eyewitness testimony, that has been for many decades kind of a real interesting and somewhat controversial topic of research, particularly as children have become witnesses in certain trials, whether it's domestic, like divorce, separation, or child abuse and neglect, witnessing crime and so forth. There's been a lot of question about whether children can serve as effective and accurate witnesses. Now, memories are constructive and reconstructive. That's true for adults as well. That's from past events, we're trying to construct the details of what we remember. Children have schemas for all sorts of information, and these affect how they encode, store, and retrieve information. So again, they have the schema for what they do in the classroom, for what they do at a restaurant or in the park or with their friends. And that is going to affect how they encode any events related to that and retrieve it. And it might mean they fill in gaps and remember things that didn't happen because it's, again, they're using the gist and they're using the schemas from past events. So several factors that influence the accuracy of their memory is that there will be age differences in children's susceptibility to suggestion. So again, Suggestion affects all of us. And going back to the zoo schema, if a child usually goes on the little train that's at the zoo, that becomes part of their zoo schema. I usually go on the train, but maybe the very last time they went to the zoo, they didn't go on the train. But if asked by someone, oh, you went to the zoo on the weekend? Did you go on the train? That's a suggestion, not just what did you do at the zoo, but did you go on the train? Did you like going on the train? That would kind of plant a suggestion. Well, they're asking me this. I must have gone on the train because, again, that's part of their zoo schema. There are individual differences in susceptibility to suggestion or to reconstructing memories. So again, some of us are more suggestible than others. Interviewing techniques can produce substantial distortions in children's reports about highly salient, very obvious or emotional events. That's why asking children about sexual abuse, for example, and so forth, you have to be very careful about sort of suggestibility. Let's watch this video here. We'll give you some ideas too.
I'm Amanda, and this is Julie. We're going to talk about the common conception that children are bad eyewitnesses, and we will determine if it's myth or fact.
This is Billy and Jane. Billy is 8 years old and Jane is 6 years old.
Billy and Jane are currently witnessing a crime. This man is robbing an elderly woman.
Billy and Jane are taken to the police station to identify the perpetrator. Jane is given misleading information and Billy is not.
So Jane, which man is the perpetrator? Billy, the perpetrator may or may not be here. Please tell me if you see him.
Billy and Jane are asked to testify. Jane is asked a misleading question, and Billy is not.
Jane, when you saw the man brutally attack the elderly woman, what weapon did he use?
I'm not sure. I think maybe he had a gun.
Billy, please tell me what you saw.
A tall, blonde man with red pants mugged an elderly woman and stole her purse. He didn't have a weapon.
According to the Innocence Project, eyewitness misidentification is the greatest contributing factor to wrongful convictions, playing a role in more than 70% of convictions overturned through DNA testing nationwide.
Children perform worse than adults only when misleading questions are asked. Children are more susceptible to suggestibility. For example, when parents made misleading suggestions to their children during science demonstrations, the children made false reports in later interviews.
Children perform just as well as adults when the questions asked are fair and tactics intending to confuse the child are not used. This is shown by a study that exposed children 1 to 2 years old to a series of events, both novel and familiar, and tested their recall 18 months later. The children were able to recall many of the novel events, which demonstrates the ability for long-term recall of specific past events.
Is there any way to reduce suggestibility?
Yes, there are ways to reduce suggestibility. You can reduce the use of leading questions, use free recall, and warn the witness not to be influenced.
So, the myth is actually a fact, but only when children are put in suggestible situations and are misled.
However, if steps are taken to eliminate suggestibility, then children are just as reliable eyewitnesses as adults.
Okay, so I think that was really good. And again, that was a very unfamiliar event, the robbing and so forth. So there's probably no schema that's going to get involved. But it was clear that when you suggest to a child that one of these people was the bad guy, I wouldn't use perpetrator, and that the person may have had a weapon, so forth, especially children, they're more susceptible to suggestion because it's being done by an adult. And in their minds, again, their egocentrism, a way of looking at the world, adults usually are correct. Adults usually are know more than they do, and all of those things. So they're going to put a lot of weight in those suggestions. Memory span in adolescence increases. Working memory also increases, again, with speed of processing, with being able to organize and chunk information, that increases capacity. These improvements in adolescence and young adulthood also appear to be due to shifts in neural functioning and specific brain regions. And this is just showing these ages 8, 10, 13, 16, 24, and different domains of information, but you can see it's mostly a pretty linear increase in working memory. Now to talk about thinking, the definition of thinking, and then thinking in infancy. And thinking, it's a very broad term, but you can define it as manipulating and transforming information in memory to reason about it, to reflect on it, to think critically, evaluate ideas, solve problems, make decisions. That's a lot in that area of thinking. Thinking relies on concepts. Concepts are cognitive groupings of similar objects, events, people, or ideas. Even that little girl in the habituation experiment was gaining some concept of this shiny thing that had a color and that was being moved in front of her without necessarily a name for that concept, without a verbal label yet, obviously at age 2 months. It's unclear how early concept formation begins, and it requires using things like habituation and dishabituation to see if they tell the difference between these two things. And if they can, maybe that means they have developed two concepts, one concept A, concept B. Do they prefer to look at one versus the other because one is something new to them, suggesting they're developing early concepts. So infants' early categorizations are best described as perceptual categorization. They're developing concepts based on similar perceptual features of objects: size, color, movement, parts. And even that in the habituation dishabituation video, the 2-month-old, he said the color is different, and they're starting to be sensitive to different wavelengths, which distinguish colors. The shape of those jars was different. There was enough perceptual difference between those two jars for them to distinguish, for that little girl to distinguish. It's believed that not until about 7 to 9 months do infants form conceptual categories. Conceptual categories might include a lot of objects within a category, a lot of things within a category that could vary a lot in perceptual features, but they all belong together for a reason. Usually some function or something about them make them similar despite differences in perceptual features. Here would be an example that birds and planes actually share a lot of perceptual features. And at first, younger infants may group them all together based on just the body and the arms, kind of the wings that come out from the body. Both birds have a body and wings, and so do planes have a body and wings. And they might even be shown in the sky, and which would be other common perceptual features. But they're different. One are animals, one are something about, our mechanical or transportation or some other category. And actually by 9 to 11 months, infants begin to categorize birds with other animals and airplanes with other vehicles, despite the perceptual similarities. So actually birds and airplanes are more perceptually similar than birds are with other animals or planes are with trains and trucks, but they're starting to see that the functions and other characteristics of these two things are different and they're more alike with the things in their conceptual category. So that's pretty impressive. By 9 to 11 months, they're starting to play with more objects and even starting to name them and label them, and that might be helping them separate out those categories. Executive function, something I've studied for a long time, includes, it's kind of an umbrella term for a number of higher level cognitive processes linked to the development of the brain's prefrontal cortex, frontal lobe, the frontmost part of the frontal lobe. Executive function involves managing one's thoughts to engage in goal-directed behavior and to exercise self-control, self-monitoring, self-regulation. In early childhood, executive function involves advances in cognitive inhibition, cognitive flexibility, goal setting, delay of gratification. If you remember, if you've ever seen the marshmallow test, it's famous test, and there are many videos of this, of 3 and 4 year olds being put in front of a marshmallow and presuming they enjoy marshmallows and they want to eat it. And they're told, if you don't touch the marshmallow after, while I'm gone and I come back and you haven't touched it, I'll give you 2 marshmallows. It requires what's called delay of gratification, the gratification being touching and eating the marshmallow. It requires inhibition, impulse control, important executive functions, monitoring, self-regulation. And 3 and 4 year olds have difficulty with that. Some are better than others. And those who were better at that delay of gratification task, they actually followed them up over decades and found that they were more successful in a lot of areas of life. So that executive function, as well as the others, are very closely linked to school readiness. The more ready you are for school, the better you perform, the more you achieve, and that, of course, leads to success in life. Parents and teachers play important roles in developing executive functions. They can model it, they can support it, scaffold these executive functions. Certain key dimensions of executive functions appear to be the most important for children's cognitive development and school success. There's a whole range of executive functions that I found, but self-control and inhibition, right in here, impulse controls in a different place, but both of those, working memory, flexible thinking, but I wouldn't discount emotional control as also being really important for school performance and just getting along in school. Some research suggests executive functions a better predictor of school readiness than general IQ. Another aspect of thinking is critical thinking, where you think reflectively and productively, as well as evaluating evidence, asking not only what happened, but how and why it happened. Think about our current events and how much critical thinking is really important. And even adults are not always engaging in critical thinking, such as examining facts to determine whether there's evidence to support them. Think again of all the conspiracy theories and things out there online and statements made by people and online and social media that we are not necessarily being critical thinkers about. When we argue with emotion instead of reason, we're not using critical thinking. Critical thinking involves recognizing that there may be more than one good answer, comparing various answers, judging which is best, evaluating what people say, again, thinking about evidence, thinking whether it's logically consistent, asking questions, speculating beyond what is known, Wow, again, you can imagine there's been somewhat a lack of critical thinking out there recently. Mindfulness is an important aspect of thinking critically. It involves being alert, mentally present, and cognitively flexible while going through life's everyday activities and tasks. And it's become a real hot topic for adults, but and especially thinking about, again, quarantine, the pandemic, whether we can kind of have this mindful attitude of really being present and alert to what's going on within ourselves and around surrounding us. Children who engage in mindfulness can improve a number of cognitive and socio-emotional skills. Mindfulness training can be implemented in schools by using age-appropriate activities that increase reflection on moment-to-moment experiences. I think I'm going to skip this. I'm a little concerned about going too long and having to use YouTube again. So I'm going to skip this one video, but it's really, they're showing that if you teach children mindfulness, they show less aggressiveness, they act out less, they can sustain attention better in the classroom. Really, really quite interesting. Also, we're very interested in how to help children learn to think like scientists, to ask fundamental questions about reality, to seek answers to questions. This is part of critical thinking, and critical thinking supports scientific reasoning. For children, they often put a lot of emphasis on causal mechanisms. They think if two things happen together, that one causes the other. Now that's true sometimes, but many times these are just coincidental occurrences, not an overall pattern. But if they've sometimes developed this causal reasoning, it can be hard for them to step out of that and to, again, think about it critically, to evaluate the evidence of whether these two things are causal or not. And in general, skills scientists use to actually determine whether there's cause and effect or just a correlation and whether other factors are involved are not taught in schools. Problem solving is part of this. Again, thinking critically, scientific reasoning and problem solving really, really go together. Problem solving is important to figuring out how to attain goals, whether they're short-term goals or long-term goals. It's really important to understand goal setting and maybe achieving sub-goals along the way. Children learn to develop rules and learn better rules to apply to problems as they get older. One element is their ability to form representations of reality. As children learn more about what is relevant to a problem and learn how to encode the relevant information, they're better at using rules in problem solving. So, the more experience they gain about the real world and how it works, helps them see patterns and helps them see rules of what works and what doesn't. This is the balance scale problem that actually came from Piaget and his testing of formal operational skills. And this is, Siegler kind of updated it and found that children kind of developed rules by playing with the balance scale and understanding that heavier weights will make one side go down than the other. But it's not just this, the weight, it's also how far from the fulcrum, the middle, the weights are. And the further they are, the more it will balance out heavier weights that might be closer to the fulcrum. So figuring out that it's these two variables, both distance from the fulcrum and the heaviness of the weight, makes a difference. This is scientific reasoning because formal operations would suggest they would separate out those two independent variables and test them systematically. solving problems using analogies. An analogy involves correspondence in some respects between things that are dissimilar, and even young children can draw reasonable analogies under some circumstances and use them to solve problems. So I just picked out a couple, like for young children, socks are to feet, like gloves are to what? And socks and gloves are very different, but they both have a similar function. They may look different. They're, different in their appearance and maybe the fabric and other things, but they both have a function to cover something. And those are the kinds of things they can learn. They can easily forget that an object's being used as a symbol for something else, and instead just treat the object, in its own right. So, these analogies are, they can become more and more abstract. This one is about high hanging fruit and low hanging fruit. And there's a real, like bananas are high up and strawberries are low, but it's also a high hanging fruit is having to make something yourself, making hummus from scratch. Low hanging fruit is when something's really available to you, like the hummus truck comes to your house. These aren't really high and low in the same sense of distance, like the fruit here. And so they may get a little confused about what you mean here. Does that mean that this bowl is up high and this truck is down low? Not really. That's just a way of understanding, this kind of metaphor. Good thinkers routinely use strategies in planning. Children's selection of effective strategies in solving math and memory problems appear to improve quite a bit from 3rd grade to 7th grade. So, at the end of elementary school into middle school. Thinking in adolescence, very important cognitive change in adolescence is the improvement of executive function, as the frontal lobe is really developing to the point that's becoming sort of at adult level of maturation. Adolescents are better able to monitor and manage their cognitive resources. Cognitive changes in adolescence also allow improvement in critical thinking. Increased speed, automaticity, capacity of information, to allow them to notice inconsistencies and ask questions, having more content knowledge, to again notice sometimes errors in people's thinking or when it's not maybe consistent with their content knowledge. They greater range and more spontaneous use of strategies for obtaining and applying knowledge. Clearly with the internet, there are good strategies for finding valid information. Fortunately, there's a lot of invalid information out there too. So there are programs now for teenagers to be able to ask the right questions, critical thinking, to distinguish between fake news and real news, or valid information or invalid information. Adolescence is a time of increased decision-making. Older adolescents are described as more competent in decision-making. They're more likely to generate different options, examine a situation from many perspectives, anticipate consequences. That's a frontal lobe executive function process. Consider the credibility of sources, but decision-making is far from perfect. And like most people, adolescents are better at making decisions when they're calm. That is when emotional arousal is lower. Emotion cognition for all of us, but particularly in adolescence, can be really connected, and often emotions can interfere with good thinking. And that's where adolescents can engage in risky behaviors because of the social context. Risky decisions are often made about alcohol, drugs, other risky behaviors. We talked about that whole adolescent egocentrism. personal fable. It's not going to happen to me. I understand the consequences for others, but somehow this egocentrism means sort of interferes with that link that it could happen to me as well. There's good research, and again, I'm getting low on time. So this was research by Lawrence Steinberg, who has done a lot of research on adolescent decision-making, risky decision-making. He found that putting them in a simulated car situation, allowing them to drive fast or, and do different things behind the wheel in this, again, simulated situation, make decisions about how to handle things on the road. He found that when peers were there, whether they were friends or not, I think, just other adolescents were in the room with them, that they tended to make more risky decisions, which is very interesting. I think I'm going to skip a couple here because things are it's really getting late. But let's talk about metacognition again. Part of thinking, it's cognition about cognition, knowing about knowing, thinking about your own cognition. Again, it involves several dimensions of executive function, planning, evaluation, self-regulation. Meta memory is a kind of component of metacognition where we know about memory. We know what works, how to remember things, how we best remember things, how we best retrieve things, what our strategies, the strategies that work for us versus maybe someone else. Theory of mind is, this book kind of puts it in part of metacognition, because theory of mind is awareness of our own mental processes, but also the mental processes of others, that other people have memories, they have knowledge, they have perceptions, they can see things. Remember the 3 mountains task we talked about last? That is a little bit about theory of mind. What is that other person perceiving on the other side of the mountains? What is another person feeling when I take their toy? If we understand that they're feeling bad, that's a theory of mind. Also reflects empathy. What does another person want? And theory of mind is really fascinating. Children ages 2 to 3 years of age do start to understand that desires are related to actions and similar emotion and simple emotions. A key development is the understanding that others' desires may differ from their own. So between 3 and 5 years of age, children come to understand that the mind can represent objects and events accurately or inaccurately, that they may know something because they saw it happen in front of them, but if somebody else didn't see it happen, they're not going to know. They may have what's called a false belief about this event or this object, that just because you as a child know it doesn't mean somebody else won't know it, will know the same thing, and that other people can hold these false beliefs about the world. And in fact, you can trick them into thinking something that isn't accurate. Until you have that understanding of theory of mind and that people can hold false beliefs, you're not going to understand that you can trick them into holding a false belief. So I want to show you this. It's called the Sally Ann False Belief Task, and getting pretty close to having to end here. So in the false belief task, the skit above, in which Sally has a basket, here's Sally has a basket, and Anne has a box, and that's shown to children. Sally places a toy in her basket and then leaves. What Anne does next here is take the thing, removes the toy from Sally's basket and places it in her box. Then Sally comes back and the children are asked, where will she look for the toy? Well, Anne knows where the toy is. Anne knows that the toy is in the box, but Sally wasn't there when it was moved. what Sally should know is something different from Anne, that they each have a different belief. One has an accurate belief because she was there and she put it in the box. Sally has a false belief. She thinks it's still in the basket. And when you see young kids, because they saw it go in the box, if they don't have a theory of mind, they're going to think Sally thinks it's in the box too. They can't disconnect their mind from others' minds and understand that Sally can hold a false belief. So we'll watch this quickly, and then I think we're going to wrap up. Things are getting late.
And this is Sally and Anne's basket and box. And one day, Sally and Anne were playing with a block in their house. And then Sally decided to put the block in the box. And then she decided to go outside and play where she couldn't see or hear anything, right?
Yeah.
Okay. Now Anne, that tricky Anne, decided to take the block and put it in the basket. Now since Sally is outside, did she see Anne move the block? No, she didn't, did she? No. So when Sally comes inside, where will she think the block is? She'll think it's in there. Why will she think it's in there? Because it's in there. Okay. Jack, this is Anne, and this is Sally. And these are Sally's basket, Anne and Sally's basket and box. And guess what? One day, Anne and Sally were playing with a block in the house. And then Sally decided to put the block inside the box. And then Sally decided to go outside and play, where she couldn't see or hear anything that was happening inside. Bye, Sally. Well, that tricky Anne, guess what she did?
She took it out of the box.
She took the block and put it in the basket. Now, did Sally see Anne move the block?
Because she was outside.
That's right.
Swinging.
That's right. She didn't see. So when Sally comes back in, where will she think the block is?
In there, but it's not. It's in there.
So she'll think it's in the box.
Yeah,
Why do you think she'll think that?
Because she put it there.
So that was a really good
This
example.
is Sally and Anne's basket and box.
All right. Get back here. Okay, that was a good example of one little girl who could not split what she knew, which was it's in the basket now, from what Sally would know, who had a false belief that it was still in the box where she put it. It was kind of the opposite of the picture here. But you saw the little boy who even knew where it was, but could kind of inhibit that knowledge and think about what would be in the mind of someone who didn't have that knowledge. And only beyond the preschool years do children begin to understand that behaviors don't necessarily reflect thoughts or feelings. They move from understanding beliefs can be false to realizing the same event can also be open to multiple interpretations. That's a pretty important understanding, that just because they react one way, somebody else might react a different way. And again, these are there are individual differences in the ages when children reach certain milestones. And executive function, as I said, this idea to be able to inhibit what you know or what you're feeling and kind of understand somebody else might have a different either knowledge or feeling. It requires inhibition, it requires flexibility of thinking, and even some self-control and self-monitoring. By 5 or 6, children usually know that familiar items are easier to learn, short lists are easier to remember, recognition's easier than recall. They have all this good metacognitive, meta memory information. They still tend to have an inflated opinion of their memory abilities, don't really have good appreciation of cues to memory. All of these things require learning strategies, and that takes some time to learn to 11 or 12 years of age. Adolescents have a much better capacity to monitor and manage cognitive resources. Their increased metacognitive ability results in improved cognitive functioning and learning across the board. They have better meta level understanding of strategies, what works, what doesn't, what works for different circumstances. But there's still considerable variation. And adolescents who are quite good at using metacognition tend to improve their learning and just do better in school, achieve more in school. Done. We better get off before this is too long to put onto Canvas. Take care. We'll see you next week with chapter 9. We're skipping chapter 8, 9 on language. Take care.